Hey y'all, Jay Nice on the mic. It's been a while since I recorded a video, but with all this anti DEI stuff, y'all know I'm a DEI girly. I actually have been recording videos and talking about DEI on my page for the last 5 years, but I am a DEI consultant. I've been working in the DEI space for over a decade. And so, with all of this DEI stuff and conversation, I felt like it was necessary for me, as somebody who has been working in this space and doing this work for a considerable amount of time, to offer my 2 cents. I have my notes here, so I'm going to be looking down at my notes to make sure that I don't forget anything. But I really wanted to provide my voice in this conversation, especially since it's my domain. So let's get into it. So again, to just briefly give a description of the work that I do, I have a consultancy that I started in 2018, and most of what I do is consultation, with companies, organizations, and institutions to help them create environments that are driven by equity. And I do a lot of workshops and trainings. And I've had federal clients. I've had most of the clients that I work with are private companies. And I have also, like, an added layer of this is I've also written over 400 articles on diversity, equity, and inclusion over the last 7 years. And so there's so many misconceptions about DEI, what DEI is and isn't. And so I felt like it was also necessary for me, as somebody who has been doing research around DEI. I work in DEI, for me to offer my perspective. So I'm making this video because we see all of the DEI rollbacks that are happening, right? And the current administration has signed some wild executive orders which make it very, very challenging for federal employees to continue the equity work, continue the work based in justice and civil rights that our ancestors have laid the groundwork for. So that's why I felt like it was important to make this video. So I want to set expectations. This is not going to be a doom and gloom video. I want to be realistic, right? And I'm also going to cite research for those of you who are not familiar with DEI and the DEI space. And what's wild is that, like, I remember 2 years ago, I posted a video on my Instagram where I was talking about how I was doing this, like, course, or I was having this webinar basically to help DEI practitioners and consultants navigate what was happening in 2022. And this was like after 2022, I believe, was after affirmative action was repealed. Maybe it was, yeah, it was 2022, not 2023, right? And so I had created this webinar and I posted it on my Instagram, right? I was like promoting the webinar and I was telling people, if you are in the DEI space and you want to learn more about consulting, if you are if you work as an internal DEI person and you want to learn more about consulting, I want to share what I've learned in these last several years with you. I posted it on my Instagram, and I remember somebody that I'm connected with on Instagram was like, "What is DEI?" And so it's so funny that we went from that place just a couple years ago to now, where every single headline is DEI, DEI, DEI. And so I just I just want to level set expectations, bring research into this conversation, bring reality into this conversation, because there's so much fear mongering from these right wing. I don't even want to call them, and I think it's disrespectful to our ancestors to call these people activists. These are not activists. These are agents of chaos who are trying to muddy the waters. But I just want to create a video to really help people understand the real. So that's what this is. So what we've been seeing in the public landscape is a lot of corporations, and I won't say a lot, there's been a couple that have been backpedaling when it comes to their DEI initiatives. These are the very public ones that we've seen in the news. Many of us are familiar with these corporations, so it has been easier for this to grab the headlines because these are very public companies that we are all familiar with. Some of them are companies that we support. But on the other side, there are also a lot of corporations that have stuck to their guns and said, we are not getting rid of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Costco is a big one. I actually made a video on LinkedIn about Costco that went viral. And there were a lot of people in the comments saying that they were going to discontinue their Costco memberships because of their rolling back of DEI initiatives. And so, what's interesting and what I do want to note is that according to research, there was this really interesting research study done by HR Drive, and I will link it below. But there was a really interesting research study where they found that, and the headline is very misleading, right? The headline is like 1 out of 8 companies are scaling back on their DEI efforts. But if you actually read the article, essentially what it says is 7 out of 8 companies that were surveyed are continuing their DEI efforts. And I think that that's very, very encouraging. I actually did a poll on my LinkedIn and I got over 500 responses from assumably like DEI practitioners. And what the results indicated were that the majority of folks who do this work are going to continue doing this work. And I posted this poll December of 2024, so it wasn't that long ago. But the majority of the folks that were surveyed or that were polled indicated that they're going to continue this work or that they're going to amp up their efforts. So what we're seeing in the news again is a lot of propaganda and is not based in reality, but it grabs the headlines. It's very salacious and sexy to see, oh, Target is getting rid of their DEI efforts. And I think that when you look at the what the research actually says, what is not true is that all of these companies are scaling back. There's a few select ones, but the majority of companies, many of which are small corporations, are mid-sized corporations, some of which we've probably never heard of, are continuing their equity efforts, right? So I made this video about how if a company was really committed to DEI, there would be nothing to ban because equity would be embedded into their policies and their practices and their procedures and their systems and the way that they run their business. So I'm going to drop that video right here. So let's talk about these companies banning DEI. Y'all know I had to give my 2 cents. So I just want to say that if DEI was actually embedded into the fabric of your workplace, and that is like woven into your policies and your practices and your processes and your decision making and your leadership and your culture, then there should actually be nothing to ban because it wouldn't be like a separate initiative. It would just be how you within the workplace actually operate. So to be honest, most companies, if we're really being honest, started performing DEI after the murder of George Floyd. So they got their chief diversity officers, they launched like DEI task forces, and they made these like very public promises and proclamations, but they never actually made equity foundational to the workplace. So that's why these initiatives are being cut so easily, because they were never meant to last in the first place. They were very surface level, reactionary, and more of like a PR move to quiet all of the noise that we heard in 2020. They were never meant to reallocate power or disrupt the status quo. So when I hear companies say we're banning DEI, what I really hear is we never actually built equity into our workplace in the first place. Because if we did, there would actually be nothing to ban. So what I want to also say is that there is a cyclical nature to this backlash, right? Throughout history, anytime that there has been a perceived win by historically excluded and marginalized communities, there has been this backlash, right? We saw this in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, right? What happened was that the formation of the KKK followed very quickly after enslaved people in America were freed, quote unquote, right? And we also saw this in 2012 in 2008, but specifically there was a study done in 2012 where they looked at anti-blackness and anti-black sentiment. And what they found was that after the election and the re-election of former President Barack Obama, anti-black sentiments actually increased based on their research, right? So there was this progress, right, with the election of the first black president, and then there was this backlash. And so what's happening now is a result of the focus on anti-blackness that really amplified in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of companies were focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now we're seeing that rollback and that resistance, right? But this is just part of the trajectory and the pattern of anytime there is progress, there is this resistance that follows. So right now, what can you do? If you're somebody watching this who supports equity work, maybe you work as a equity practitioner or a change maker in some way, what we have to do is shift our focus from corporate-led DEI efforts to really focusing on grassroots efforts. Shameless plug, but not shameless plug. I actually created a DEI resistance playbook, which you can see right here, where I provided a very detailed and thorough guide on how those of you who are engaging in equity and change making work can combat the resistance that you may be seeing within your organizations and your institutions. So I'm going to leave a link to that below so you can check that out and grab your copy if this is something that you want more tools on. But we have to really shift our focus again from corporate led to grassroots efforts. And then we have to continue equity work, but we're not labeling it as DEI, right? There is a lot of work that is considered equity work that doesn't have the DEI label. For example, ensuring that people are paid fairly at an organization or an institution is technically DEI, but it benefits everybody, right? And so we have to understand what DEI is, understand the DEI misconceptions, which I've written about ad nauseum, understand what DEI is, understand what DEI isn't, and really dispel myths. Because a lot of the reason why it's so easy to roll back DEI efforts and initiatives is because there's so much propaganda around DEI. People don't understand, there's misinformation. And so equipping people with the accurate and adequate information is important, right? I've written over 400 articles on this topic. And so any opportunity I can to share information that is accurate and that is research-based is important. So make sure that you are equipping yourself with the information and the knowledge to share with people, especially those who don't understand what DEI is, right? Regardless of all of this backlash from this current administration, equity work will always be needed. Organizations need to operate in ways that are fair and that are perceived as fair by employees and by customers. Folks are not going to support companies that don't treat people fairly, that don't treat people equitably, that aren't operating in an inclusive way. And so any organization that does not prioritize these values of equity and fairness are, simply put, not going to be sustainable in the future. So that is actually something that gives me hope and that I think about a lot, is that these companies think, well, we're going to roll back these things and, go woke, go broke or whatever. But at the end of the day, right, folks who understand what DEI is and what it's supposed to do recognize that any organization that is not rooted in fairness is not going to last and is not going to be sustainable. So what needs to change? Because I'm not somebody that thinks DEI is perfect. There's a lot wrong with DEI. I've specifically written an article where I highlighted all the things that were wrong with DEI, or some of the things that were wrong, right? But as a equity practitioner, I can acknowledge that this field doesn't, the space, we as DEI practitioners don't always get it right, of course, like any other field, right? And so what should we do, or what needs to change moving forward? Well, first, we have to move away from performative DEI, which I hit on in the video that I shared, right? We have to make sure that DEI and equity is embedded in everything we do in our workplace. I'm not going to get into that right now, because there's a lot that this video would be like hours and hours, but there's so many ways to embed equity and fairness into our workplace, and you have to make sure that you are engaging in those activities versus performative DEI. Also, thinking about reframing the language. DEI right now is just a very divisive term, to put it honestly. What's wild is, y'all, I have this my first book was called Dirty Diversity, and I have a podcast of the same name. And literally the reason I created that is because in 2019 I felt like diversity had become such a divisive term, right? Little did I know that 6 years later things would be even more contentious. And so, like DEI, diversity, these specific buzzwords have become very contentious. And so, we have to continue to do work that's rooted in equity and fairness and justice. But it's important that we recognize the framing and how certain words and terms are just very triggering and will automatically cause resistance. So we have to recognize that and think about ways that we can combat that. And we can do that through the language that we use specifically around this, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also must empower employees to push for systemic changes instead of relying on corporations and those in power. I do think that leadership, what happens at the leadership level, trickles down, but there can be change happening from the ground up where those who are at junior levels in the organization build coalitions and band together. And that's the power of unions, right? To advocate for change. So there are some things that we can all do, whether you work in the space or not, to really make sure that our workplaces are environments that are built on equity, fairness, and justice. So, what do I think moving forward? Again, I think that a lot of the anti DEI rhetoric is based on misinformation, propaganda. The reality is that, yes, there are companies that are doing away with DEI. According to that research I mentioned earlier, 1 out of 8, but a majority of companies are keeping their DEI efforts. A majority, according to a poll, which again, I'm a researcher. I know that this might not necessarily be a representative sample of people who do DEI work, but again, this is important information to know. According to the poll for my LinkedIn page, a majority of the folks who do this work are continuing their efforts or going harder. So we can't be let the media tell this narrative that this work is dying, right? DEI is dying. No, it's not. It's just changing, right? Which is necessary. It's we're in an iterative state and things are constantly evolving and changing, right? So just some closing thoughts that I have is I want to encourage those of you who are doing this work in whatever form that we must continue. We rise, right? This backlash, we can't be deterred by what is happening. And a lot of the media and a lot of what we're hearing is propaganda to keep our nervous systems hijacked, to keep us overwhelmed by the news cycle. And so I try to tune out of a lot of this stuff. I have friends and family that send me stuff because they know I'm in DEI. So they're like, look at this, look at this. And I'm just like, I look at it. I don't necessarily click these things. I try to equip myself in the truth. And what is the truth actually saying? What is the research actually saying? And what is the data actually saying? And I think that equipping ourselves with the truth is what will help propel us and sustain us and sustain this work in this current moment where, if we being honest, it's a lot, right? So I want to know in the comment section below what you are seeing in your workplaces. How are you thinking about DEI in the future for those of you who engage in this work? And I encourage you to connect with me on social media. My favorite platform is LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn the most, and that's where I engage in a lot of these conversations. So if you want to learn more, check me out on LinkedIn. Also, if you want tools to navigate the DEI resistance, check out my toolkit, the DEI resistance playbook. I've linked that in the comment section below, in the description below. And yeah, I want to know what y'all think, how you're moving forward. And that's where I'm going to leave off this video. I'll check y'all out in the next video.